All right, last week we read chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, and so we will go through chapter 6 today, or this evening, as we go for our study. Now, last week we were introduced to Darius the Mede, and he, as we begin this chapter, he is setting up his government in the kingdom. And as we begin the first verse, we see that there is 120 princesses that was set over his portion of the kingdom of Babylon. And in verse 2, he sets over them 3 presidents. This is the only time, chapter 6 is the only time this word president is used in the Aramaic, and it simply means an overseer, or I forgot the other word that I wanted to use, but anyway, someone of authority. A governor, or an overseer. That's the other word. And so as we go on through here, we are introduced to several types of individuals. It would seem that they are in descending order of how his government would be set up. And it reminds me very similar to what Moses did in the advice that Jethro gave Moses to set people up over the people, in tens, and then in hundreds and thousands, and which just makes sense. One man cannot govern everything all by himself, and so. But it also kind of leads back to what we were talking about at the first, that he was answering to somebody else. It was important for him to have people that were underneath him that would govern correctly and govern well, so that he would have no hurt, and that so he could answer well to somebody else above him. And history seems to bear that out, that he was answering to Cyrus the Great. Okay, I think it's also interesting that how now the kingdoms have changed hands. It was the kingdom of Babylon, and now it has passed over into the Medes and the Persians. And guess who rises to the top? We always talk about cream rising to the top. Guess who has risen to the top once again? Now, how has that happened? God is with Daniel. Daniel is not a spring chicken, as we talked about last week. He is an old man at this point. But yet, it would seem that he still has enough strength and vigor and enough wisdom that he is noticed. And Darius the Great, or Darius the Mede, sees, because we will be talking about Darius the Great. I'm already a little ahead of us. All right. Darius the Mede sees how capable this gentleman is, and wants to put him in a position of authority, wants to make certain that this man is involved, even though he may be an older gentleman. What do we know about older gentlemen? There's a lot of wisdom that goes with them at times. And so he has been very powerful, or very astute, very good in helping the governments in times past, and he's going to take advantage of that. And a person would be a fool not to, wouldn't they? So Darius, in some ways, shows himself to be somewhat astute in trying to handle his affairs, but he makes a bit of a slip up too, doesn't he, as we go on here. Okay, so as we get into verse 3, we see that Daniel was preferred above all these presidents. Now you get to the people that's right underneath him, it would seem. He had three individuals that he was dividing responsibilities, as it were, to, and he would prefer this one man, and that would be Daniel, over all the rest of them. Okay? And so he sought to set him over the whole realm. He could see that Daniel was so capable that he could rest all his affairs in Daniel's capable hands. Okay? All right. Now we come into verse 4. Verse 4, something comes up, doesn't it? Now I've mentioned this several times because it keeps coming up over and over and over. I believe history has pointed out that because of a certain amount of religious thought processes or religious problems in the kingdom had something to do with Belshazzar's fall and Nabonidus' fall as kings. They didn't govern the people well. They stirred up the people in the wrong way, and so there was religious strife at the time. So we see that kind of thing coming up again in these individuals. They don't like Daniel, and so they're going to now find fault. Which, in what way?
Through his faith in his God, as they
Yeah. Now, as pointed out, it's in his God. And why is that pointed out, his God? That's exactly right. It's a contrast, isn't it? There is Daniel's God, and then there's our gods. So there's a contrast pointed out, very starkly here. The only way they're going to find anything wrong with him, because there is nothing wrong with the way he governs. He's very astute. He's very good at what he does. So there's no fault they're going to find with him there. He's not the kind of individual that's siphoning money off. He's not the kind of individuals that shows what's the right word? Favoritism in one area or another. He does and governs justly. So they're not going to find fault with him in the way he governs. So the only way they're going to find fault with him is in the law of his God. And why would that be?
He's faithful to it.
Because he's faithful. There are certain things that he will not give on. And when it comes to the law of his God, he will not relent. He is faithful to it. And no matter what somebody says or does, he will remain faithful to his God. Now, how many people can say that? We see this all the time. If the population moves this direction, what do the religious leaders of the day do? Do you know the policy of the Catholic Church says vox populi, vox Dei, or if I'm not saying it correctly, I can write it out for you. But do you know what that means? The voice of the people is the voice of God. Literally means if the people want to do this, then God must want it to be done that way. In stark contrast to anything the Scriptures teach. But they're not the only ones that do that. We see denomination after denomination after denomination. Well, you know, we have to change with the times, right? But that's not what we see here. There's an excellent spirit in him. And they could not find anything wrong with Daniel except in the law of his God, because he was unrelenting in that. In the law of his God, he would not give in. He would not compromise. He would not go down to the land of Ono. Oh no, he would not go. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to look that up. Because when the captives were trying to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, they said, come down, let's have a meeting down in the plain of Ono. He said, no, We have the Lord's work to do. They would not compromise. We cannot compromise. That does not give us latitude to be nasty or ill-tempered or things of this nature. But compromise is not part of God's plan, is not part of God's people. And we will not see it here in this chapter with God's man Daniel. Okay. Verse 5. And these men got together, they began to talk amongst themselves, and says, we can't find any occasion against Daniel except according to the law of his God. Verse 6, they make a plan, don't they? And they get in front of the kingdom of the king, and, O king, live forever. Well, that's a common greeting. So far, they're not doing anything that anyone who approaches the king wouldn't say. Daniel, I'm sure, would say the same thing. That was the appropriate greeting for the king at the time. But then they go astray, don't they? They said, we've all gotten together, and we've decided something. And what did they decide, and why did they decide it?
Well, first of all, the funny thing is they said they all got together. Well, guess who one of the three presidents was? Daniel. So they lied to him. Daniel didn't get with them and make this scheme against one of the presidents.
Okay. What else? They weren't all together on it because Daniel wasn't part of it. Okay? What else was in there?
Petitions another God besides the king will be thrown in the land.
Okay. Again, now this religious thing comes up again, doesn't it? So what does that suggest to you? Why would that be appealing to the king? Yeah, but I think there's something more to that. If it's true that there was turmoil in the kingdom, as some has suggested, some historians have suggested, that would be appealing to the king because it would kind of calm down some of that turmoil, wouldn't it? Or at least it might have that effect. So there could be that background thing going on. There's turmoil in the kingdom, so they have this thought that at least they're presenting it towards the king this way. That would be why it would be appealing. Now, if anyone makes an appeal, they have to come just to you, and you're the only person that anyone can make an appeal to. Maybe that'll calm some of this religious turmoil that's going on in the kingdom right now. So I suggest that maybe that's going on. But yes, again, you talk about stroking his ego. It kind of strokes his ego a little bit too now, doesn't it? So the king lets his ego get a little bit ahead of himself, or maybe a whole lot ahead of himself, and says, okay, all of you gotten together and agreed on it. That doesn't sound too terribly bad. So okay, let's go ahead and do it. Now what else do we now, in verse 8, so for 30 days, no man now, they write out a law, and so 30 days now, nobody can make an appeal to anybody except Darius. And in verse 8, what do we learn about the law of the Medes and the Persians? It cannot be changed. That's one of the things I would suggest to you that the Medes and the Persians brought to civilization. A strong law. A law that even the king himself couldn't break. That hadn't happened before. Kings of old could arbitrarily make a law, and then he could arbitrarily break it any way he wanted to. But now, when he signed his signet ring to a according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, could the king break the law that had been signed? No, he could not. And we will see that under Queen Esther. We will see that again and again throughout the law, throughout the Medes and the Persians. See, so they brought to civilization that idea that there is a law, that men are bound by law. And the Romans, again, we see that during the Roman Empire. But who invented that idea? The Medes and the Persians. Couldn't be broken. The king himself was bound by the law. So that's an interesting point that we need to think about. God's law does not change. We need to think about that. We need to remember about certain things about law. And the law of our land doesn't need to be arbitrary either. I think we've had a problem with that over the past several years as well. But I digress. Okay. Verse 9, therefore Darius signs the writing and the decree. Okay, anyone know what an interdict is? Talked about an interdict. I guess that's only in the American Standard Version, isn't it? Talks about the interdict. So if you read the American Standard Version, you know what an interdict is.
The law, decree.
Well, it means something which is forbidden. Interdict has to do with something which is forbidden to do.
Irrevocable?
Well, no. It says a decree or an interdict in the American Standard Version. It defines a little bit more about what this type of decree actually was. It was an interdict. It wasn't just any type of law. It was a decree which forbade a particular action. And an interdict is something which forbade an action. And that's why the American Standard uses that particular term. Okay. In verse 10. Now when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he went into his house with his windows open in his chamber towards Jerusalem, and he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. I find that interesting, do you not? That he went and prayed as soon as he knew it was signed.
I don't think he was trying to rub it into their face. I think he didn't want to give the appearance of, because of their decree, that he was going to go and pray. He's going to do the same thing he's been doing all along in the same manner he's always been doing. I think that's what Daniel does do.
I think you've hit the nail right on the head. He was not thumbing his nose in their face. He was just going about doing what he always did the same way. He was not going to compromise. He was just doing what he always did the same way he always did. And what's interesting is they knew he would. And that's why they made that decree. Something as simple as prayer. But they knew he would. Why was his windows open toward Jerusalem?
That's an interesting thing because technically the only place to worship is Jerusalem, but they were in bondage. So they couldn't go to Jerusalem. The idea of looking towards Jerusalem was looking towards where God said to worship. It was as close as it could get, I guess, not being able to actually go to Jerusalem to worship.
The verse of Scripture, I had it locked in my computer, but I lost it, so I don't have the page. When Solomon commissioned the temple, in part of his long speech, and it's a fairly long speech, you need to go back and read it. In part of his speech, as he dedicates the temple, one of the things that he says, and of course I'm paraphrasing now because I wanted to read the actual section. He said, when you find yourself in bondage, when you find yourself in, when you sin and God, because he reiterates the same thing that Moses reiterates, that when you sin, God will put you in bondage by your enemies. And so Solomon reiterates the same statement, that when you find yourself in the hands of your enemies and in bondage, if you will pray towards this place and ask for forgiveness, he will forgive. So what do you think Daniel has been doing for the last 70 years? 3 times a day. With his face towards Jerusalem. And we're going to read his prayer. As he confesses the sins of his people, and he begs his heavenly Father for forgiveness. And he says, we have sinned. If this kind of a righteous man could realize his people have sinned and they need to go on their knees and ask for forgiveness, how much more humble should we all be when we approach our God? 3 times a day he would turn towards Jerusalem. I can't think of a more humble individual and more humble thing to do than what this man was doing. No, he wasn't thumbing his nose at anybody. He was praying for his people.
I think the passage you was alluding to, I don't know if it is now, but 1 Kings 8, verse 33 says, I think it kind of goes along, says, when thy people Israel be smitten down before the enemy, because they have sinned against thee, and shall turn again to thee, and confess thy name, and pray, and make supplication for thee in this house, then hear thou in heaven, and forgive the sin of thy people Israel, and bring them again unto the land which thou gavest unto their fathers.
Yeah, if you'll read that, that's exactly that. Yeah, I thought it was in 1 Kings, but I couldn't remember. If you'll read that whole section, you'll find a section where he talks about they will be driven from the land, but if they will pray and ask for forgiveness, they could return to the land. So this is the reason why he is doing exactly what he's doing, why he's got his doors open towards Jerusalem. He's praying towards that place. He's praying these people might be able to return to Jerusalem and worship God as God would have them to. Okay.
We need to remember that the temple was where the Ark of the Covenant was, which represented the throne of God. And so, obviously that's to whom you'd be praying, God. And, today, when we pray, in essence, we open our windows, but we don't look to a physical place. We've been given the opportunity to pray directly to God because Jesus broke down that wall between when he sacrificed himself on the cross. The veil rent, and there's the Ark of the Covenant right there in front of everybody. So it's the idea was look to where God is.
Certainly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's a great analogy. But yeah, and all saints have that avenue of prayer. And that's another topic for another time. But I know a lot of individuals think that anybody can pray, but only saints have that wonderful avenue of prayer and that mediator that we can pray through. That we have that ability, and we should be thankful for. So that's a great analogy. Appreciate it. Okay. All right. Notice, as we've already read in his prayers before, that he always gives thanks to God. And of course, the scriptures tells us that we should always be thankful. No matter what our circumstances is, we should always be thankful. Okay. And verse 11, shall we say the panther pounces? These men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. It's not like they didn't know this. This was their plan to begin with. They did exactly what they intended. And then they came near and they spake before the king. And then they asked the king, said, "Didn't you do this?" It seems to be, the way I read it, and maybe I'm hearing it wrong, but the way I read it, this seems like arrogance unmitigated to speak to the king in such a way. Didn't you do this? It's like a small child, trying to goad somebody. Well, this goading the king is going to come back and haunt him. But nonetheless, that's just the way that it comes across to me, is they're goading him. Instead of just saying something, there's a barb that goes with it. He says, "Didn't you sign a decree that if any man..." Well, they know that he signed the decree. They're the ones that brought it to him. And the king said, "The thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which..." What? "Altereth not." And they answered again in verse 13, Daniel, and now they bring this thing in, right? Now they bring in that extra little bit of dirt that's been eaten at them, right? This is where the crux of the matter is. They didn't like Daniel. That Daniel, like a little child, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah. He's a captive. You put him in a position of authority, and he's a captive, and you put him over us. You can just see their faces when they say it, can't you? He's a captive. And you put him on the same level as us?
Actually, no. They were jealous because he put him higher than them. He was actually higher than them, and they were jealous. That's the whole crux of the matter.
Oh, that was the crux of the matter with them. Prejudice has been around for thousands of years, hasn't it? Had nothing to do with the fact that he was the right man for the job. It had everything to do with their prejudice against him. Because he was a Jew, because he was a captive, they didn't like the way he wore his tunic. Who cares? It's prejudice is prejudice. When people hate people because of something, they hate people because of something. He's got too good of a tan. He's too dark. He's too light. He's from the wrong tribe. He didn't have enough education. He's got too much education. You name it, people hate people for other things for whatever reason they hate people for. Prejudice is...
It's still with us today.
Yeah, and we see it today. I don't like police. Yeah. Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters? Yeah. I mean, really. I mean, it's sickening and it's childish. It's certainly not mature. It's not mature spiritually. It's not mature mentally. I mean, it's not good for society. I mean, any which way you want to look at it, it won't make a good situation at work. It won't make a good situation as society. It won't make a good situation in your home. Name a situation where prejudice works. It destroys, period. Nonetheless, that's all you see here. Didn't matter the reason why they didn't like him. They didn't like him. Okay. All right. And verse 13, regardeth thee not? That's not true, is it? Well, boy, they'll twist it that way. When somebody really wants to do something, they will twist whatever word they want to, because they can kind of make it twist and make it look that way. Well, he doesn't regard you. Nor the decree which thou signed, but makest his petitions 3 times a day. Well, it's true, he made his petitions 3 times a day, and yes, it's true, it's against the law. But was the law a good law to begin with? Verse 14, when he heard these words, he was sore displeased with who? With himself. Well, he should have been displeased with himself. He was the nitwit that signed the law.
Yeah, I wonder what he was thinking to himself when he realized they had tricked him into doing this against the
He
guy.
realized he'd been tricked. Yeah, that's exactly right.
The very guy that is his best guy, his best president, he got tricked into having to do something against him now.
Now, how many people, and this is the reason why I kind of like Darius, how many people realize that I've made a mistake and I need to try to fix it? Now, who hadn't made a mistake in their life? You going to raise your hand? I certainly can raise my hand. But at least he realized I made a mistake. I let somebody bamboozle me. And for not the right reasons. But at least he realized that. Okay? He was mad with himself. All right, now he's angry, and now they're going to goad the lion a little bit, right? He was sore displeased with himself, and he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He tried to figure out some way he can fix this, but he couldn't figure out a way, because he can't get around the law. In verse 15, then all these men that have this thing in for Daniel, they come up, and what did they say to him? Remember, O king, you can't get around the law. The law's been signed. Okay? Do you really want to say that to that man at that point? Well, they did.
They had so much jealousy that he didn't care.
Maybe that's it. Maybe they were just so angry, they didn't care. They were just so mad.
Not to get too far off point, but it does show, I guess, the genius of the Constitution and our forefathers, that they knew enough not to make this mistake. They made it so any law that they made could always be changed. And so it's interesting how we learn from the past and examples like this, where you get yourself into this kind of situation.
Or should learn from the past.
Actually, I just made that point today with somebody that we need to learn the lessons of the past.
I
We
might add
don't.
that our forefathers made it hard to change. They made it possible to change, but they made it hard so that there's a difference between not changing. But they made it, I think the idea of the alternate not was, they understood that if a king came and said a law and then he didn't, and then he went back and said, well, I don't like it, or as some people today say, well, this is what the Bible says, and then something happened, and they go, I've changed my mind on that. So they had the right idea, but the idea was, Not that it couldn't change at all, but that it needed to be difficult to change. In other words, there had to be good reason to change it.
But even wise men can make mistakes like this, and that you need an out to correct yourself when you make a mistake in the law.
And there's only one law that doesn't need to be altered. And that's the one that didn't have a man didn't write the law.
Yeah. Yeah, God's law hasn't made a mistake, and it doesn't need to be changed.
But to go back to your, when you said it kind of led through history, this idea of ultimate knowledge. It was good in the sense that by the time Jesus gets on the scene, this was not the first time people ever had heard that here's a law that won't change. It wasn't new to them. They had heard of such a law. So when that came about, that wasn't a shock to their system. It was like, so he said, here's a law. It's not a man-made law. It's a perfect law. It's from God. It's a heavenly law. But it won't change. No man has the right to change it. So it did kind of, like John the Baptist was a forerunner, these things did kind of forerun to get people ready for Christianity.
And it's exactly what we are taught about the law of Moses. The law of Moses was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. Man had to be educated about sin, had to be educated about God and how he deals with sin. That was the purpose of the old law. And it wasn't intended to last. It had to die upon the cross. And that's the reason why there was a period of time that man was ignorant both of God, of law, of the consequences of sin, the ugliness of sin, and all of those types of things. So there's a reason for man to slowly become educated. But I'm also wanting to see, because we're going to go into that, and I've got to quit, I guess. But I want you to see that there was also things that man began to learn from the empires and the kingdoms that rose. There were things that man began to learn from those things too, and that law which changes not was one of them. Anyway, we will continue on in verse 15. At verse 15 next week. I thank you very much for your kind attention and your participation.